Hello and welcome to Retroformat Live Q&A. Once again, I'm Sean P. Malone, cinematographer and proud board member at Retroformat Silent Films. Tonight I have with me Serge Bromberg, film preservationist extraordinaire and founder of Lobster Films in Paris, France. My favorite description of Serge is one penned by the late great David Shepard, who called Serge an international crusader for cinema. No title could be more apt, Serge. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Sean. Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello from Pacific time.
Well, yes, this is Paris time, so I'm 9 hours ahead of you guys. But nevertheless, the joy is still entire.
Well, good evening. Tonight we get a glimpse of Max Linder in 7 Years Bad Luck. And I'm sure there's many viewers out there discovering Max for the very first time. Could you talk a little bit about what you know about his screen persona and what made him so special?
Well, we know a lot about Max Linder. The thing is that Max was actually the first ever star for comic films. He was launched by Pathé in 1905, and in France at the time when cinema was mostly European, he was the big star. His character was Max, and Max was supposed to be one of these elegant men who was at the same time like an anarchist, a bit always like on the limit of good taste, but always very funny. It's quite sure that Charlie Chaplin saw Max Linder in his young age. So, and he later would say that Max was his master. He would say that of a lot of people, but he would say that of Max also. Max was a real star, and until the war, 1914, obviously, he had the lead in everything. But of course, in 1914, First World War, Max goes to war, he's wounded, so he has to come back and cannot stay at the front. And at the same time, 1914, of course, is the beginning of slapstick cinema in America. So all of a sudden, no more production in Europe, a lot of production in America, and obviously the game changes completely. For an example, you know that Charlie Chaplin was at Keystone in 1914, then at SNA in 1915. And at the end of 1915, when he leaves SNA for Mutual, SNA wants to try to replace him. And what star do they think of? Max Linder. Of course, he's French, but
Right.
It doesn't make a difference because cinema is silent. So he goes to America and makes 3 films for SNA without the success that they expected.
I see.
But just to give you the magnitude of who Max Linder was, he even built a mega huge cinema on the boulevard in Paris that is still there, called the Max Linder. So Linder has had these days of glory, then war, then after the war, Linder has taken taste of America and made friends with Douglas Fairbanks, Chaplin, Griffith. So he goes to America, and for 2 years, he makes 3 feature films that are absolutely hilarious. Be My Wife, 7 Years Bad Luck, that we're going to see now, and The Three Musketeers. And those 3 films are absolutely unique because they mix the elegance of the French character and the means, the studio, the wealth, the money of his friends in America, plus the strength of United Artists who will eventually distribute the films. So those films will be all over the world. And Max had a comeback like that.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's one of the things I was going to ask you a little later is other Max films that we could check out after seeing this one. So that's a great recommendation.
Yeah. And those films are distributed through Kino. So you can find a Blu-ray set DVD with Kino, and they have the 3 films plus 2 of the SNAs, I believe.
Wonderful. Max Linder, you just pointed out, obviously was French, but he was internationally known. You know, Chaplin was English, Buster and Harold were from the American Midwest. but they all had this universal fame and appeal.
No, I mean, it was a bit more international at the time of silence because obviously you could have a Russian-speaking actor speaking with the Danish-speaking actor, and nobody would care because the sound wouldn't be recorded. Of course, those limits would appear when the sound cinema and the talking pictures would arrive, and that would be the end of the careers of so many actors would have terrible voices or would have very strong accents, like me, for example. So if Max Linder had been alive in 1927, he would have had issues with the language, which did not happen.
Do you think we lost something there, like from the silent era into the sound era? Did cinema kind of get more insular or more nationalistic?
That I don't know, but it's a language on its own that disappeared, which is, well, what do we do when we have only the image to pass the feeling of not only visual, but also sound environment? When talkies arrived, all of a sudden people wanted to talk, sing. They would have a mic above their heads and they would like, no. I speak like that just to be heard. And that's a big loss to cinema. That's the beginning of something else. Of course, we must not live in the past, but let's say that those 35 years of silent features and silent films in general have been probably one of the lost paradises of our history. You know, when you had pantomime, the reason there was pantomime is that there was so much noise that even if the actors would have spoken, no one would have heard anything. So they would pantomime, and the minute they invented the microphone and amplification, people started to speak, and that's what we would call today stand-up. But that's talk. We have lost this art of expressing things with our bodies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an art, really.
Well, this film in particular contains, God, I don't know what else to call it besides the notorious broken mirror sequence or the broken mirror gag. And of course, we've all seen this replicated by the Marx Brothers and Lucille Ball. So you can obviously see Linder's influence on those comedians. Where else do you think we can find his influence, both in subsequent films and subsequent comedians' work?
Well, that broken mirror sequence is, of course, I mean, the genius of the Marx Brothers is that's the peak, but it was there before. I mean, obviously, the broken mirror is one of those pantomime routines that have been taught to so many actors in the 19th century and 20th century. We have the examples of 2 or 3 silent films before Max Linder, where you would have the pantomime routine, not as elaborate, but kind of the same thing. So, you know, at the time, the actors would copy from each other. The diffusion, the broadcast of the films were not instant as they are today. If someone saw a good joke somewhere, he would like steal it. And by the time someone found out, it would be a few months, a few years. So basically it was stealing. Even more, all those people were taught on stage. And that stage training was based on a few routines, like, for example, be a drunkard. I mean, you think it's easy to fake to be drunk? It's not that easy. And when you see Max Linder, when you see Charlie Chaplin, when you see Stan Laurel being drunk, they are obviously trained to be drunk. Right. And they do the same jokes, the same little movements. It's basically the DNA is the same. They do different things with it, but sure, the DNA is the same.
Well, I mean, they all had that training on Americans in vaudeville, right? And Charlie in the Music Hall. Yeah. Do you know what was Max's training and background?
Max was a theatrical actor, but very early on, he left the stage to go to the studio. He started with a classic acting career, but I mean, very, very early. He was grabbed by Pathé and became a Pathé star. So he made hundreds of films and didn't have the exact training that Chaplin and Keaton and Laurel would have, which is like, you know, every day, 10 times a day, do the same number, improve it. Oh, it didn't work like this, I'm doing it like that. You know, the Marx Brothers, you can feel that whatever they do, they've done 100 times, and they control literally everything, which is brilliant. Max Linder was not of that kind, but he controlled everything that was on the screen. He was directing his own films from the beginning, almost from the beginning. And you can see that the guy is in total control. 7 Years Bad Luck is really a masterpiece. That's one of the very first silent films I ever saw. It was part of a compilation called Pop Goes the Cork that was produced in the 60s by his daughter, Maud Linder, who passed away about 5 years ago. And Pop Goes the Cork was 7 Years Bad Luck in a terrible version, and two fragments that were the two things that survived at the time on the other two feature films. And I found Max Linder so charming and so destructive at the same time. I mean, that guy has no respect for anything.
Right.
And it may be one of the big differences with the American slapstick actors. He is supposed to be elegant, to be one of the high-class people. And of course, he's a brat.
Absolutely. Well, do you have a favorite gag from either 7 Years Bad Luck or Max Linder's films?
Well, I hate to speak of favorite gags because,
Yeah.
well, I like the way he plays the piano when you watch it. I mean, the build up on the piano.
Yeah.
But everything is what I like in this film and in all his later films, because at the beginning of films, the grammar of cinema was much slower, is that there is surrealism. There is everything here is absolutely impossible. That's what makes it necessary. So the film is you know, you would have Chaplin, which is a bit romantic, Keaton, who would be completely geometric, very like surrealistic, and Linder would be in the middle. You would have the best of both, although I must say that the role of the woman is rather minimal. She's like an alibi in making Max funny and funnier all the time.
Right. Well, that's a good way to describe it.
Yeah.
Earlier, I talked about David Shepard. I mentioned his name. Some of those folks watching out there are familiar with David and know everything he did for silent cinema. Can you talk a little bit about maybe how you met David and what your friendship with him was like?
Well, I met David in the funniest way. I was in the East Coast, and I met a collector who was collecting religious films. That's in the late 80s. And I asked him, well, where did Black Hawk go? Because I used to buy Super 8mm films of Laurel Hardy from France. And the man said, well, I don't know. I think it's a man called David Shepard who lives in Los Angeles. So I left for Los Angeles. Instead of coming back to Paris, I canceled my ticket, went to Los Angeles, and called every David Shepard in the phone book. There were 15, and 14 answered, and they were not the right one. I was to stay 5 days in Los Angeles. In the night before my leaving the next morning, at about midnight, there was one number that didn't answer. I said, well, let's try. And I tried one last time. And the guy who answered was David Shepard. Oh, are you Mr. Shepard? Yes. Forgive me, I'm Mr. Bromberg. I'm a French collector. You don't know me. I would like to meet you. I leave tomorrow at 8 by the plane. Can I meet you? And he said, well, of course. And 1 hour later, we were in the San Fernando Valley in the Black Hawk laboratory, and I was surrounded by all those printing elements and the original nitrates from the Black Hawk collection. And that's, you know, it's like striking a match. I mean, and so we've been friends forever. Then we started working together with the Black Hawk collection. And we've been the closest friends since then until he passed away in 2017. And since then, he gave us the responsibility of running, preserving, and restoring the Black Hawk film collection and all the films he had gathered through his long career.
Well, that's a perfect segue to my next question, which is, you know, he said you were an international crusader for cinema. He called you a cinema evangelist. And
no evangelist, please.
Well, you know, along those lines, what can we, the fans of classic and silent cinema, do to help preserve, to protect, to further this art form?
Well, there's only one thing to do. If you know where to find films, go to the nearest archive and let them know that the films are here. Taking care, restoring films is a passion. It's also a craft, a profession. There are so many good things and so many bad things you can do with classic films. So you need to put those films in the hands of professionals. That doesn't mean that you are giving those films away. I mean, you can just deposit them, but more than half of the films, much more than half of the silent films are lost forever because they have not been kept and they have decayed. And I mean, everyone knows those stories of films that burnt or turned to dust. So there may be in the attics or basements of people who are viewing that interview old rusty cans that may seem lost or not interesting. Well, everything is always interesting. So if you know of an archive, just make a list of what you have and call them. Let them know that you have this. And if they tell you, well, that's interesting, send them the films or talk with them. If they tell you, well, that's Chaplin, that's Laurel Hardy, these films are around, and okay, no big deal. You'll have made a good deed. You'll have tried.
That's a great way to end our conversation, Serge. Before we sign off, though, is there anything coming up from Lobster Films or that you're working on personally that you'd like to mention?
Is there anything we're working on at the moment? Well, in the last 10 years, there has never been less than 10 films in progress at the same time at Lobster. We're working on most of the Julien Duvivier silent films. He was a French, very famous director. We, of course, have those restorations of Buster Keaton major films, and we're working on 2 of them now. And the big, huge project that we have today in the works, but it'll take another probably 2 years now with the COVID, is a plan to restore the Georges Méliès American negatives, the Méliès project, with so many partners that you would not believe it. The French CNC, the Cinematheque Francaise, of course, the Library of Congress, and the Academy of Motion Picture. But we also have the Film Foundation, Alexander Payne, Marty Scorsese, the MoMA, UCLA, so many people. And in the end, it'll be so flabbergasting that I don't want to tell you more at this moment.
Oh, that sounds awesome. And Alexander Payne serves on our board, actually, Retroformat's board. So.
Well, nobody's perfect. No, of course. That's great. Remember, what's important is not to restore the films, is to restore the audience. And that's what you're doing at Retroformat.
Thank you so much. Serge, it's been really, really great to talk to you. I've learned a lot. I'm sure our viewers have. A reminder to everyone before we sign off, if you enjoyed tonight's performance and Q&A, please consider making a suggested donation of $7 to Retroformat by visiting retroformat.org/donate. Your support means the world to us. I'd like to once again thank our guest, Serge Bromberg, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you all next week for the next installment of Retroformat Live. I'm Sean P. Malone. Good night, everyone.